What if Spider-Man shot bubbles instead of webs? Today, I'm building a wrist-mounted web shooter for my 2-year-old son. But instead of strings, foam darts, rubber bands, or anything that can accidentally hit someone in the face, this shoots bubbles. Because when you're building for a 2-year-old, projectile is just another word for something I'll regret immediately. Every time he sees bubbles in the bath, he gets excited, and that's the kind of thing we love. Growing up, Spider-Man was one of the reasons I wanted to learn gymnastics and flips. I loved the way he moved, the way he jumped, the way he flipped, all whilst cracking a joke about being late for dinner. There's just one massive engineering problem. My son's forearm is about 9 cm long, which is tiny. And a working bubble machine needs a fan, a fluid pump, a rotating wiper, a battery, a switch, and space to put the bubble solution. Fitting all of that onto a tiny toddler arm without making him look like he's wearing a toaster was going to be tricky. Step 1 was to understand how a bubble gun actually works in the first place. So I did what any responsible maker would do. I sacrificed a perfectly good Bamboo Lab bubble kit for research. Well, I broke some of the clips I was trying to figure it out. Inside, it's actually pretty simple. There's a pump, there's a wiper, there's a fan. It's simple, maybe too simple. Because once I saw it, I immediately thought I can totally design a better, flatter, sleeker mechanism myself, which was my first big mistake. I tried designing tiny gear systems, a reciprocating wiper, a flatter fan. Basically, I tried to become an engineer through sheer stubbornness, which is impressive because I'm not a mechanical engineer. I'm a chiropractor. I spend my day fixing joints, but apparently tiny plastic joints in fusion are not covered in my degree. Part of the problem was I had bought a small bubble gun mechanism from Taobao and started designing around that. It looked promising because it was compact, and in my head, compact meant easier to turn it into a wrist shooter. But I didn't properly test whether the mechanism was actually good enough before building around it. So after all that designing, the printing, the adjusting, and overthinking, I ended up with something that technically worked. It produced one single, sad bubble every second. Toddlers don't want a slow stream of individual bubbles. They want full-blown bubble chaos. And this was not chaos. This was when I realized the problem wasn't just my execution. The whole direction was wrong. I had spent all this time trying to improve a mechanism that was limited from the start. So instead of reinventing the bubble machine, I went back to the one system I already knew worked, the Bamboo Lab kit. And most importantly, it produced a proper cloud of bubbles. So the new plan was simple. Keep the working bamboo system, but rehouse it and reshape it, split the parts around the arm and make it feel like Spider-Man. Instead of putting one giant block on the wrist, I split the system across his arm. Underneath the wrist, I kept the fan and the bubble output. On top of the forearm, I placed the battery pack and the switch so he could activate it with that classic Spider-Man wrist flick. And for the bubble solution, I figured a small flexible pouch strapped higher up onto his arm would free up pressure space on the forearm. The bamboo kit was originally designed to fit one single bubble gun. Everything was close together, the battery, the switch, the motor, the fan, and all that wiring. But once I split the system across his arm, the wires obviously weren't long enough anymore. So I did some quick, snip-snips, added wire extensions, and technically it worked. But now I had a new problem. There were wires dangling between the two sections, which is not exactly the clean Spider-Man look I was going for. So I designed a TPU gauntlet to mount the electronics. Then, to hide the wiring and make it feel more like part of a suit, I planned to sew a spandex cover over the whole gauntlet. I wanted the cover to include the classic brick pattern from the Brand New Day suit design. That way, the shooter wouldn't just be a gadget strapped onto his arm, it would actually feel like it's part of the whole Spider-Man look. From the start, I knew the shooter couldn't just be something he turns on with a random button, because then it's just a bubble machine on his arm. Fun, yes, but Spider-Man, not really. The whole thing had to come down to the gesture, the closed fist, the wrist flicked up, and bubbles coming out. So when I split the system across his arm, I placed a switch on the top side of the forearm. That way, when he makes a fist and bends his wrist upwards, it naturally presses the switch. The bubble output stays underneath the wrist, so his palm is out of the way. and the bubbles would shoot from the same place you expect the webs to come out of. That was the detail that made the whole design click. The bamboo kit gave me the bubbles, the 3D printed shell gave it the shape, but that wrist flick, that's what made it feel Spider-Man. The spandex cover helps to tie the whole gauntlet into the suit, but the actual bubble shooter housing still needed its own Spider-Man identity, because without the suit it could easily look like a red plastic bubble machine strapped to his arm. So I started adding web patterns directly into the 3D model, not just as decoration but to make the shape feel intentional. Because red plastic on the forearm could be anything, but red with web lines built into the shell, that starts to feel like Spider-Man. After all the failed prints, the flawed mechanism, the rewiring, the test fitting, the fabric cover, way too much overthinking, the final version finally came together. The bubble mechanism sits under the wrist, the battery and switch sit on the back of the forearm, the tubing feeds the bubble solution, and the whole thing wraps around his arm like a tiny Spider-Man gadget. It's not as ultra thin as I originally pictured, it's a little bulkier than the version in my head. This Spider-Man uses macro tack instead of nano tack, but it works. Moment of truth, shooter mounted, solution loaded, and the Spider-Man flick. Now at first he looked a bit confused. Usually when there are bubbles, he's the one trying to run around and pop them. But then he got it. Wrist up, you know, switch pressed, and suddenly bubbles. Actual bubbles. Not one set bubble, not one slow bubble, but real bubbles coming from his wrist. And once he realized he was the one making them, that was the moment. That was absolutely worth every failed print. This project started with one question: can I turn a working bubble machine into a toddler-sized Spider-Man web shooter? And the answer is sort of. It's not perfect, it's not as sleek as I imagined, it's bulkier than I wanted, and I definitely learned more about bubble machines than any chiropractor ever needed to know. But when he flicked his wrist and the bubbles came out, none of that really mattered. It worked, it was safe, and it made him smile. So that's a win. No projectiles, no injuries, just bubbles. And now that I've learned way more about tiny mechanisms than I expected, and I may or may not have a CNC that just arrived, which I haven't even opened yet, there's a very real chance I come back to this. Maybe a cleaner version, maybe a slimmer version, maybe even revisiting the mechanism properly this time. If you like watching me overcomplicate simple toys for my toddler, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, keep leveling up. See ya!